The morning Henry Marshall rode to the post office in Hartville, the postmaster handed him a letter with handwriting he recognized, but a postmark that made no sense. Henry had made the ride into town for supplies, salt and flour mostly, things that his own farm did not produce, and that required periodic trips to the settlement. Hartville was small, barely qualified as a town, just a cluster of buildings at a crossroads where farmers from the surrounding hills came to trade and collect mail and share news. The post office occupied one corner of the general store, operated by William Turner, who served as both storekeeper and postmaster and informal keeper of community information. Turner had been sorting through the morning's mail delivery when Henry entered, arranging letters and packages according to the names he knew, the families who lived scattered across the territory that the Hartville post office served. He looked up when Henry came through the door, nodded in greeting, and continued his sorting. "Letter for you," Turner said after a moment, pulling an envelope from the stack. "Came in this morning's bag." Henry took the envelope, recognizing his brother David's handwriting immediately. David wrote regularly, not frequently, but regularly enough that receiving a letter was normal, rather than notable. They kept in touch through correspondence, despite living only 12 miles apart, distance that made visiting possible, but not convenient enough to occur more than every few weeks. But something about this letter was wrong. Henry looked at the postmark. March 11th, 1871. It was March 18th. He stood at the counter trying to understand why a letter mailed a week ago was just arriving. Hartville was 12 miles from the Marshall farm where David lived. The mail route ran regularly, twice weekly, covering the circuit that connected Hartville to the smaller settlements and isolated properties in the surrounding hills. 7 days should have been more than enough time for a letter to travel 12 miles along a route that the mail carrier knew and traveled without difficulty. "Something wrong?" Turner asked, noticing Henry's expression. "Postmarks dated the 11th, Henry said. Turner looked at the envelope, shrugged. "Can't say why it took so long. Weather's been clear all week. No reason for delays that I know of." Henry thanked him, purchased the supplies he had come for, and stepped outside to read the letter before beginning the ride home. The March sun was warm, the kind of early spring warmth that suggested winter was ending, even if cold nights still came occasionally. The air smelled of mud and new growth, the scent that marked the transition from frozen ground to earth that was beginning to wake. He opened the envelope carefully, unfolding the single page inside. The paper was good quality. David was careful about such things, bought proper writing paper rather than using whatever scraps were available. The handwriting was neat and controlled, the same careful script David had used since they were children, learning letters at the school their mother had insisted they attend, despite the farm work that made regular attendance difficult. But the words were strange. "Henry, the storm is coming now. I can see it from the window, moving across the valley faster than storms usually move. Dark in a way that isn't just clouds, in a way that makes the air feel wrong. I wanted to write while I still could, while the light holds and I can see to form the letters. If you're reading this, then I didn't." The sentence ended there. No period, no dash, no trailing off. Just stopped mid-word, as if David had been interrupted while writing, as if something had prevented him from finishing the thought he had started. Henry read the incomplete sentence again, trying to determine if there was more that the ink had rendered invisible, if the paper was damaged in a way that made text disappear. But the page was intact, and the sentence simply ended where it ended, incomplete and unexplained. The letter continued. "Tell Mother I tried. Tell her the farm was good this year, that the land gave what we needed, that the work we put into clearing and planting was not wasted. Tell her I wasn't afraid when... Again, the sentence stopped without completion. Again, no punctuation or trailing mark, just cessation, as if the act of writing had been forcibly interrupted, or as if David had decided against finishing thoughts that were too difficult to express. The rest of the letter was brief. The storm is here, March 11th, 1871. That was all. No signature beyond the date. No closing pleasantries, no explanation of what the storm was, or why it warranted this strange, fragmentary communication. Henry read the letter 3 times, standing outside the general store, trying to extract meaning from the gaps between what was written and what was deliberately or accidentally omitted. Each reading created more questions than it answered. What storm was David referring to? Henry tried to remember the weather on March 11th, a week ago, and could recall nothing unusual. No storms had passed through the region. The week had been cold but clear, the kind of late winter weather that was unremarkable and unmemorable. And why would a storm, even a severe one, prompt a letter like this? David had lived through countless storms, had managed the farm through winters that brought weather far worse than anything March typically produced. He was not someone who feared weather, or who would write cryptic letters about clouds and darkness unless something genuinely unusual was occurring. The incomplete sentences bothered Henry most. If you're reading this, then I didn't. Didn't what? Survive the storm. Finish something he had started. Make it through whatever event he was anticipating. The ambiguity was unlike David, who was precise in his language, who said what he meant and finished his thoughts. Henry folded the letter carefully and put it in his coat pocket. He loaded the supplies he had purchased onto his horse and began the ride back to his own farm, but his mind was not on the familiar trail or the tasks waiting at home. His mind was on David and the strange letter and the sense of wrongness that the incomplete sentences created. By the time Henry reached his farm, he had decided to ride to David's place the next morning. 12 miles was not a great distance, but it was far enough that making the trip required dedicating a day to travel rather than farm work. Normally, he would wait for a reason to visit, to borrow tools, to help with work that required 2 people to share news that could not wait for the next letter. But the strange communication demanded immediate response, demanded verification that David was safe and that the storm, whatever it had been, had passed without incident. Henry's wife Margaret met him at the door of their cabin, took the supplies he carried, asked about news from town. He told her about the letter, showed it to her, watched her face as she read the incomplete sentences and the reference to a storm that neither of them could remember occurring. Maybe he meant a different kind of storm, Margaret suggested. Trouble with something, worry about something, not actual weather. This was possible. Language allowed for metaphor, for using weather to describe states of mind or circumstances that felt overwhelming. But David was not someone who spoke in metaphors, who wrote letters that required interpretation. If David said storm, he meant weather, meant clouds and wind and rain or snow. "I'm going to ride out there tomorrow," Henry said. "Make sure everything's all right." Margaret nodded. This was reasonable. This was what family did when communication suggested concern. She did not try to dissuade him or suggest that he was overreacting to what might be nothing more than an oddly phrased letter about weather that had seemed more dramatic than it actually was. Henry slept poorly that night, waking repeatedly to think about the letter, about the incomplete sentences, about the phrase, "I wasn't afraid when," as if David had been anticipating something specific, something that would require courage to face. By morning, he was awake before dawn, eager to make the ride to David's farm, eager to resolve the unease that the letter had created. He left as soon as there was enough light to see the trail, riding north along the route he had traveled many times. The morning was cold but clear, frost still white on shaded ground, the sun climbing into a sky that held no clouds and gave no indication that weather was anything other than normal for mid-March. The trail led through forest for the first few miles, then opened into cleared land where other farms occupied valleys and hillsides. Henry passed the Henderson place, saw smoke rising from their chimney, saw evidence of morning activity, chickens being fed, someone carrying water from the well. Everything normal, everything as it should be on a March morning when spring was approaching, and farm families were preparing for the work that planting season would bring. The Marshall farm, David's farm, though Henry still sometimes thought of it as their father's place, despite 2 years having passed since their father's death, occupied a valley that was broader than most in the area, with good water from a creek that ran year-round and soil that had proven productive in the 20 years the family had been working it. Their father had chosen the location carefully, had cleared the land methodically, had built structures that were solid and well-positioned. David had taken over the farm's management with the same care and precision their father had shown. He maintained what needed maintaining, improved what could be improved, worked the land in ways that respected what it could provide, without demanding more than it could sustainably give. As Henry crested the rise that overlooked the valley, he could see the farm spread below him, the cabin, the barn, the cleared fields waiting for spring planting, the fence lines that marked boundaries and kept livestock contained. From this distance, everything appeared normal. The buildings stood as they should stand. The land showed the patterns of recent work, fence mending, wood cutting, the ongoing tasks that farm maintenance required even in seasons when major work was not yet possible. But no smoke rose from the cabin's chimney. This by itself was not concerning. The day was warming. Fire might not be necessary for heat. David might be working outside or away from the cabin entirely. But combined with the strange letter, the absence of smoke felt wrong, felt like another small piece of evidence that something was not quite right. Henry rode down into the valley, following the path that led from the main trail to the cabin. The path was well worn from years of use, marked by wheel ruts from the cart David used to transport supplies and by the tracks of regular passage. His horse, his boots, the patterns that daily life created in ground that received constant traffic. As Henry drew closer to the cabin, he called out, announcing his presence in the way that frontier courtesy required. Approaching someone's home without warning was considered rude at best, dangerous at worst, in a time and place where unexpected visitors might signal trouble. "David," he called. "It's Henry." No answer came back. Just the quiet of mid-morning and early spring, birds calling from the forest edge, wind moving through bare branches of the oaks that shaded the cabin's western side, water running in the creek that fed the property. Henry dismounted at the cabin door, tied his horse to the post that stood for that purpose, and knocked. He waited, listening for movement from inside, for David's voice responding, for any indication that his brother was present and had simply not heard the initial call. Silence. He tried the latch and found the door unlocked, not unusual for isolated farms where locking doors was less common than in towns, where trust in distance and lack of traffic made security less of a concern. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The cabin was empty. Not abandoned. That was Henry's first clear impression. The space showed signs of recent occupation, of normal life interrupted but not concluded. David's coat hung on its peg near the door. His boots stood beside the fireplace where he always placed them to dry. The table held a plate and cup from what had likely been breakfast, the remains of food still visible, though dried now from days of sitting undisturbed. Henry moved through the cabin slowly, cataloging what he saw, trying to determine when David had last been present and what his absence might signify. The bed was made. David was particular about such things. Made his bed each morning, as their mother had taught them both. Maintained order in his living space, even when living alone made such order optional. The writing desk in the corner was neat. No scattered papers, no evidence of recent use. Henry opened the desk's small drawer and found writing paper and ink, the supplies David used for correspondence. But there was no copy of the letter that had been mailed, no draft showing what David had written before sending it to Hartville. This was not unusual by itself. Many people did not keep copies of letters they sent. But given the strange content of the letter Henry had received, he had hoped to find some indication of David's thinking, some explanation for why the letter had been written in that particular way with those particular, incomplete sentences. Henry searched the cabin more thoroughly, looking in places where David might have left notes or messages, where explanation might be found if explanation existed. He found nothing beyond the normal possessions of a man living alone on a working farm: clothes, tools, supplies for cooking and cleaning, books that David read in the evenings, the accumulated items that daily life required and that farm life accumulated over years of occupation. He went outside and checked the barn. The door was closed but not latched, swinging slightly in the wind that moved across the valley. Inside, David's horse stood in its stall, eating hay from the manger. The cow occupied the adjacent stall, showing no signs of distress or neglect beyond needing to be milked. Her udder was full, suggesting she had not been tended that morning, or possibly the previous evening. Henry milked the cow, fed both animals properly, checked the chicken coop and found the birds healthy, but eager for the feed that David normally provided. The animal's condition told him that David had been gone for perhaps a day, maybe slightly more, long enough for the animals to need care, but not so long that they had suffered from genuine neglect. He walked the perimeter of the farm, looking for tracks that would indicate which direction David might have gone if he had left on foot. The ground was soft from recent thaw, should have taken and held footprints clearly, but the only tracks he found were the normal patterns of daily movement: paths to the barn, to the well, to the woodpile, to the outhouse. No trail led away from the immediate farm area into the surrounding forest or toward the road that would take someone to other properties or to town. This absence of tracks was strange. If David had left the farm, he would have walked in some direction, would have created a path through ground that was soft enough to record passage. But the forest edge showed no evidence of entry. The road showed no evidence of travel. The fields showed no evidence of someone crossing them. Henry returned to the cabin as afternoon was beginning to fade toward evening. He had found no clue about where David had gone, no indication of what might have prompted his departure, no evidence that would explain the letter, or the absence, or the strange references to a storm that appeared to have had some significance beyond normal weather. He decided to stay the night, to wait and see if David returned after being away for whatever reason had taken him from the farm. He fed the animals again. They would need evening care, even if their owner was not present to provide it. He built a fire in the cabin's hearth, using wood from the supply David had stacked beside the door. He sat at David's table and ate simple food from the supplies that were stored in the cabin, feeling uncomfortable occupying his brother's space without invitation, but unwilling to leave when David might return at any moment. Night came, early, the way it still did in March when full daylight had not yet extended to the longer hours that April and May would bring. Henry sat by the fire, listening to the sounds that darkness brought. Wind in the trees, the occasional call of an owl hunting, the creaks and settling sounds that old wooden structures made. He tried to read one of David's books, but could not focus on the words. His mind kept returning to the letter, to the incomplete sentences, to the phrase, "The storm is here," written as if something specific and immediate was occurring. But what storm? And why would it cause David to leave his farm without his coat, without his boots, without making arrangements for his animals, or locking his door, or doing any of the things a person would do if departing with intention? Sleep came eventually, but was not restful. Henry woke repeatedly, listening for the sound of the door opening, for David's return, for resolution to the mystery that the day had deepened, rather than solved. But morning came without David's return, without any change to the situation, except that another night had passed with the farm's owner absent and unaccounted for. Henry rose at dawn, fed the animals again, and made the decision to ride back to Hartville, to ask if anyone had seen David in the past week, to organize a search if David's absence continued to have no explanation. He left the cabin as he had found it, locked the door this time to protect his brother's belongings, and began the ride back toward town. The return journey took the same 2 hours the outward journey had taken, covering familiar ground under a sky that was gray, with high clouds that suggested weather might change soon, even if change was not imminent. Henry arrived in Hartville mid-morning, went directly to the general store where William Turner would know if anyone had information. "You seen David lately?" Henry asked. "In the past week or so." Turner thought for a moment, then shook his head. "Can't say that I have. Not since—" He paused, calculating, "must be 3 weeks back. He came in for supplies, same as you did yesterday. Anyone else mentioned seeing him?" "Not that I recall. Why?" Henry explained about the letter, about visiting the farm and finding David absent, about the animals needing care and the lack of any indication where his brother might have gone. Turner listened, his expression shifting from casual interest to concern as the details accumulated. "That's strange," Turner said. "Strange about the letter's timing. Strange about him being gone. David's not someone who'd leave his animals unattended." "I'm going to ask around town," Henry said. "See if anyone knows anything. Then I might need to organize a search party." Turner nodded. "I'll ask folks who come in today. See if anyone's seen him or knows of any reason he'd be away from his farm." Henry spent the rest of the morning and early afternoon asking at the smithy, at the few houses that constituted Hartville's residential area, at any place where people might have information. He asked carefully, not wanting to create alarm when there might be a simple explanation, but asking thoroughly enough that if anyone had seen David or heard anything relevant, the information would emerge. No one had seen David Marshall since mid-February. No one had information about where he might have gone or why he might have left his farm. The consensus among those Henry spoke with was that David's absence was concerning, that organized searching would be warranted if he did not return soon. By the next morning, Henry had assembled a search party, 6 men who knew the territory and who were willing to spend time looking for someone who might simply have had an accident or gotten lost or experienced some mishap that made return difficult, but not impossible. The group included Turner, who closed his store for the day, Thomas Henderson from the farm Henry had passed on the way to David's place, Robert Price and his son James, and Martin Wheeler, who had helped build David's barn and knew the property well. They rode together to the Marshall farm, arriving by mid-morning. Henry showed them the cabin, the animals that continued to need care, the lack of tracks leading away from the immediate farm area. The men spread out, each taking a section of the surrounding territory to search systematically. The search pattern was methodical. They started close to the farm and worked outward in expanding circles, looking for any sign that David had passed through the forest, any indication of where he might have gone or what might have happened to him. They searched along the creek, thinking he might have followed water. They searched the trails that connected to other properties, thinking he might have been heading somewhere specific. They searched the rough country to the north, where hunting sometimes took men, thinking he might have been tracking game. They found nothing. No tracks beyond the trampled area around the farm buildings. No signs of disturbance that would suggest struggle or accident. No torn clothing caught on branches, no dropped items, no blood, no indications that would explain absence or suggest direction. By afternoon, the men had covered perhaps a mile radius around the farm, searching carefully and thoroughly. They regrouped at the cabin to discuss what they had, or had not, found. "It's like he just vanished," Henderson said, voicing what they were all thinking. "No tracks, no trail, nothing to follow." "People don't just vanish," Wheeler replied. "There has to be something. We're just not seeing it." "Could he have left before the ground got soft?" Price suggested. "Could he have walked out when the ground was still frozen hard enough not to take tracks?" This was possible. Frozen ground did not record passage the way soft ground did. But the timing made this explanation insufficient. David's letter was dated March 11th. The ground had been soft since late February when thaw had begun. If David had left after writing the letter, the ground would have been soft enough to show tracks. "We keep searching," Henry said. "Tomorrow we expand the radius, cover more ground." The men agreed. They would search again the next day, would continue until they found David, or found evidence that explained his absence, or exhausted the reasonable area that one man could have traveled on foot from this location. That night, Henry stayed at David's cabin again, keeping vigil over his brother's belongings, caring for the animals, waiting for return that did not come. He sat at the writing desk where David had sat to write the strange letter, trying to imagine what David had been thinking, what he had been seeing from the window that would prompt references to storms and darkness and messages that ended mid-sentence. The window faced west, looked out over the valley toward the ridgeline that marked the property's boundary. Henry sat looking at that view as evening light faded, trying to see what David might have seen, trying to understand what the storm might have been if it was not actual weather. He saw only the normal progression of dusk, shadows lengthening, light fading from sky that remained clear, the transition from day to night that occurred the same way every evening, and that held nothing unusual or threatening or strange. Sleep came late that night, and when it came, it was filled with dreams of letters that could not be read and storms that could not be seen, and his brother's voice calling from somewhere close, but unreachable. The search continued for 3 more days. The men covered expanding areas, working outward from the farm in all directions, searching forest and creek beds and rough country, and every place that seemed like a location a person might reach or might end up if lost or injured. They searched systematically and thoroughly, and they found nothing except the ongoing absence that had prompted the search in the first place. On the 3rd day, James Price found something. Not David, not evidence of where he had gone, but a detail that made the mystery deeper rather than resolving it. James Peterson had been searching the forest north of the farm, moving through terrain that was rough but not impossible, looking for any sign of passage. He found a tree, a large oak that stood alone in a clearing, and on that tree, carved into the bark, were words. Fresh words, recently carved, the wood beneath still white and unscarred by weather. Peterson called the others. They gathered around the tree, reading what had been carved there. The storm took me. Tell Henry I tried too. The carving stopped mid-sentence, the last letter incomplete, as if whoever had been carving had been interrupted or had lost the ability to continue. The handwriting, if carved letters could be called handwriting, matched David's hand as closely as wood carving could match ink on paper. Henry stood looking at the carved words, trying to make sense of them. The tree was 2 miles from the farm, in forest where David might hunt, but where he would have no reason to stop and carve messages. The words matched the incomplete sentences in the letter, the reference to a storm when no storm had occurred. "What storm?" Peterson asked, voicing what they were all thinking. "There hasn't been any serious weather. Not this week, not last week." Henry had no answer. He touched the carved letters, felt the fresh wood, confirmed that the carving was recent. Days old at most, not weeks or months. David had been here, had carved this message, had left it incomplete for reasons Henry could not understand. They searched the area around the tree carefully, looking for more carvings, for tracks, for any indication of what had happened after the message was carved. They found nothing. Just the tree, with its incomplete sentence, standing in a clearing where no other evidence existed. The search continued for another 2 days, but the energy had changed. The carved message had transformed the mystery from "Where did David go?" to something stranger, something that involved storms that did not happen, and messages that ended mid-word, and absences that left no trail. By the end of the week, the search was abandoned. David Marshall was gone, had been gone since March 11th based on the letter's postmark, and nothing they had found suggested where he had gone or what had happened to him. Henry returned to the farm periodically over the following weeks, hoping to find David returned, hoping for some resolution. The cabin remained empty. The animals needed care, so Henry began tending them, making the trip from his own property to David's every few days to ensure the livestock did not suffer from their owner's absence. In early April, Henry received another letter. The postmark read March 12th, 1871. 3 weeks after the date it was mailed, arriving at the post office in Hartville, as if the mail route had somehow delayed it far beyond what delay should be possible. The letter was from David. Henry opened it standing outside the post office, his hands not quite steady. "Henry, I don't know if you received my first letter. I don't know if you'll receive this one. The storm is still here. It's been here for I don't know how long. Time feels wrong. The sun doesn't move the way it should. I can see the farm from where I am, but I can't reach it. Every direction I walk leads back to the same place, the tree in the clearing. I carved a message there. Did you find it? I'm not hurt. I'm not afraid anymore. But I can't find my way out of—" The sentence stopped. The letter continued. "If this reaches you, don't come looking. Don't try to find where I am. The storm doesn't follow normal rules. It takes what it takes and doesn't give back." On the 3rd day, James Price found something. Not David. Not evidence of where he had gone, but a detail that made the mystery deeper rather than resolving it. Price had been searching the forest north of the farm, covering territory that was rough but navigable, the kind of terrain where a person might travel if hunting or exploring, or simply walking without specific destination. He had been moving methodically, examining the ground for tracks, scanning the undergrowth for disturbances, looking at tree trunks for marks that might indicate recent passage. He found a clearing, small, perhaps 20 yards across, with a single large oak standing at its center. The tree was old, its trunk thick and scarred from decades of weather and growth. And on that trunk, carved into the bark at roughly chest height, were words, fresh words, recently carved. The wood beneath the removed bark still white and clean, not yet darkened by exposure to air and weather. Price stopped, stared at the carving, called out for the others. "Over here, I found something." The men converged on the clearing from their various search positions, moving quickly through the forest toward Price's voice. They gathered around the oak, 5 men standing in a rough semicircle, reading what had been carved into the bark. "The storm took me. Tell Henry I tried to." The carving stopped there. The last letter, an incomplete T that suggested the word "to" was beginning, was shallow and unfinished, as if the person doing the carving had been unable or unwilling to continue. Henry pushed forward through the group, needing to see for himself, needing to verify what the others were reading. He put his hand on the carved letters, feeling the fresh wood, feeling the depth of the cuts, feeling the evidence that someone had recently stood in this spot and deliberately removed bark to leave a message. The letters were carefully formed despite being carved rather than written. They matched David's handwriting, or matched it as closely as knife work on bark could match ink on paper. The spacing was even, the height consistent, the overall impression one of control and intention rather than hasty or panicked work. "When was this done?" Henderson asked, touching the white wood beneath the carved letters. "Recently," Wheeler said. He was the most experienced woodsman among them, had spent years working with timber, knew how bark and wood responded to cutting and exposure. "This is fresh. Day or 2 old at most. Maybe 3. Not longer than that." "So David was here," Price said. "After he left the farm, after he wrote the letter, he came here and carved this message." Henry looked around the clearing, trying to understand why David would have come to this location. What would have prompted him to carve a message into a tree rather than simply walking back to the farm or to town or to anywhere that would put him in contact with other people? The clearing was unremarkable. Trees surrounded it on all sides, oaks and hickories mostly, with some cedars along the northern edge. The ground was covered in last year's fallen leaves, now wet from snowmelt and beginning to decay into the soil beneath. No structures were visible. No particular features made this clearing different from countless other small clearings that dotted the forest throughout this region. "Why here?" Henry asked aloud. Why would he come here? No one had an answer. They searched the clearing carefully, walking its perimeter, examining the ground for tracks that would show David's approach or departure. They found disturbed leaves near the oak, scuffing that suggested someone had stood there while carving, had shifted position, had moved around the tree's base. But they found no clear trail leading to or from the clearing, no path through the forest that would indicate direction of travel. "The storm took me," Turner read again, speaking the words aloud as if saying them would make their meaning clearer. What storm is he talking about? There hasn't been any weather that would take someone, that would keep someone from getting back to their farm. Maybe he doesn't mean weather, Henderson suggested. Maybe it's, I don't know, sickness, confusion, something wrong with his mind. This was possible. People did sometimes experience mental disturbances that made normal reasoning impossible, that created perceptions that did not match reality, that caused them to behave in ways that made no sense to observers. But David had shown no signs of such disturbance, had written letters that were coherent, even if strange, had carved messages that were deliberate, even if their content was puzzling. "Tell Henry I tried to." Price read the incomplete sentence. Tried to what? Get back? Explain? Resist whatever the storm was? The incompleteness was maddening. Every message David had left, the letter, this carving, ended mid-sentence, ended without finishing thoughts that seemed important, that seemed like information David wanted to convey but could not complete. "We keep searching," Henry said. "If he was here recently, he might still be nearby. He might be injured, might need help." The men spread out again, this time using the clearing as their central point, searching outward in all directions from the carved oak. They searched with renewed energy, driven by the knowledge that David had been here within the past few days, that the distance between David and rescue might be small if they could just find the right direction to look. They searched through the afternoon, through the hours when light began to fade and shadows made seeing difficult. They found nothing beyond the clearing and its carved message. No more carvings on other trees. No tracks that led anywhere definite. No signs that David had remained in the area or that he had departed in any particular direction. As darkness made further searching impossible, the men returned to David's farm, frustrated by the knowledge that they had found evidence of David's recent presence, but no indication of where he was now, or how to reach him. That night, Henry stayed at the cabin again. But now, instead of simply waiting and hoping for David's return, he had specific questions that needed answers. Why had David gone to that clearing? What had he been trying to communicate with the incomplete message? What storm was he referring to when no storm had occurred? Henry lit a lamp and sat at David's writing desk, examining the paper and ink that remained there, looking for anything that might provide context for the letters that had been sent. He found nothing new, just blank paper and ink sufficient for writing, but no drafts, no notes, no explanation for why David had written what he had written. He went to bed, late, his mind too active for sleep despite physical exhaustion from 3 days of searching. He lay in the darkness, thinking about his brother standing in a clearing, carving words into bark, thinking about the phrase "the storm took me" and what it might mean, thinking about the incomplete sentences that suggested David wanted to communicate more than he was able to express. Sleep came eventually, bringing dreams that were vivid and disturbing, dreams of searching for David and finding him just ahead, always just ahead, visible but unreachable no matter how fast Henry moved toward him. Dreams of storms that were not weather but something else, something that had no form, but that had presence and power and the ability to take what it wanted. Henry woke before dawn, unsettled by dreams he could not quite remember clearly, but that left residue of unease. He fed David's animals in the gray pre-dawn light, then rode back to Hartville as the sun was rising, needing to check if any news had come, needing to see if the mystery had resolved itself while he slept. It had not. David remained absent. The carving remained the only new evidence. The questions remained unanswered. The search parties disbanded after that third day. The men had families and farms of their own that needed attention, had work that could not be indefinitely postponed for searching that yielded nothing except more mystery. They promised Henry they would keep watch, would report if they saw David or found any new evidence, would help again if new information suggested where to look or what to do. Henry continued visiting David's farm regularly, caring for the animals, maintaining the property, keeping vigil over his brother's belongings in case David returned, and needed to find everything as he had left it. Weeks passed. March became April. The weather warmed. Spring planting season arrived, but David's fields remained unplowed, waiting for the owner who did not return to work them. And then, in early April, Henry received another letter. He was in Hartville purchasing supplies when Turner handed it to him with an expression that suggested he had already noticed what was strange about it. "This came in this morning," Turner said. "Postmarks dated March 12th. Henry looked at the envelope. The postmark was clear. March 12th, 1871. Nearly 4 weeks ago. The letter had taken 4 weeks to travel 12 miles along a mail route that normally required 2 or 3 days at most. And it was from David. Henry's hands were not quite steady as he opened the envelope. He unfolded the single page inside, recognizing David's handwriting immediately, feeling relief that at least David had been alive and capable of writing on March 12th, even if his current status remained unknown. The letter began simply, "Henry, I don't know if you received my first letter. I have no way of knowing if any of these messages are reaching you, or if they are being lost somewhere in the distance between where I am and where you are. The storm is still here. It's been here for what feels like days, though I can't be certain how time is passing. The sun doesn't move the way it should. It rises and sets, or seems to, but the progression feels wrong, feels too fast or too slow, or somehow disconnected from what I remember about how days normally progress." Henry stopped reading, looked up from the page, tried to process what David was writing. The storm was still present on March 12th, 1 day after the first letter. David was experiencing time strangely, was unable to measure its passage accurately, was describing days that did not follow normal patterns. He continued reading. "I can see the farm from where I am. I can see the cabin clearly, can see the barn and the fields and all the familiar landmarks that should mean I'm close to home. But I can't reach it. Every direction I walk leads me back to the same place, a clearing with a large oak tree at its center. I've walked in what should be straight lines away from this clearing, walked for what feels like hours in different directions, but every path I take brings me back to the oak tree. The clearing is like a center that I cannot leave, a fixed point that all directions lead to, rather than away from. I carved a message on the tree. I carved it hoping you would find it, hoping it would help you understand where I am even if I can't explain how I got here, or how to get back. Did you find it? Have you been looking for me?" Henry set the letter down for a moment, overwhelmed by the confirmation that the carving they had found was indeed David's work, that his brother had been in that clearing after leaving the farm, that the incomplete message had been an attempt to communicate across whatever distance or barrier separated David from the world he had left. He picked the letter up again, continued reading. "I'm not hurt. That's important for you to know. Whatever the storm is, whatever has happened, I'm not injured or in pain. I have water. There's a small spring near the clearing that provides fresh water. I don't have food, but strangely I don't feel hungry. I don't feel tired in the normal way, even though I don't think I've slept. Everything feels suspended, feels like I'm existing in a state that has no relationship to normal physical needs or normal passage of time. I'm not afraid anymore. I was afraid at first, when the storm came and I didn't understand what was happening, when the darkness moved in ways that made the air feel wrong and made breathing difficult. But the fear has faded. Now I just feel, I don't know the right word, suspended, waiting, existing in a space that has no forward movement, no progression toward anything, no sense of change or development. The letter continued with more description of David's experience, but the sentences began to show the same incompleteness that had marked the first letter and the carving. I want to tell you to come looking for me, but I also want to tell you not to. If you come to the clearing, and I think you will, I think you'll search until you find that oak tree. You might be able to see me. I might be visible from certain angles or in certain light. But don't try to reach me. Don't try to enter whatever space I'm in. The storm doesn't follow normal rules. It takes what it takes, and... The sentence stopped. The next paragraph began. I can see you sometimes. I can see you at the farm, feeding the animals, searching the cabin for answers. I'm only a short distance away, but the distance won't close. The storm is between us. Or I'm inside the storm. Or the storm has created a space that overlaps with normal space, but doesn't connect to it in ways that allow crossing from one to the other. Tell Mother I'm all right. Tell her I'm sorry I can't explain this better. Sorry I can't find my way back. Sorry that my last conversations with her were about such ordinary things when I might have said, again, incomplete. The letter ended. I'm going to keep writing. I'm going to keep trying to send messages, even if I don't know how they'll reach you or when. Maybe these letters will arrive eventually. Maybe you'll understand what happened, even if I can't fully explain it myself. Don't give up on me, but don't endanger yourself trying to find me. Your brother, David, March 12th, 1871. Henry read the letter 3 times, standing outside the post office, then read it again, sitting on the bench that stood beside the building's entrance. Each reading revealed details he had missed, created new questions even as it answered some he had been asking. David was alive. David was trapped somehow in or near the clearing with the oak tree. David could see the farm, could see Henry, but could not reach either despite being close enough to observe. David was experiencing time strangely, was not hungry or tired, was existing in a state that had no clear relationship to normal physical existence. Turner came outside, saw Henry sitting on the bench with the letter in his hands, sat down beside him without speaking. After a moment, Henry handed him the letter. Turner read it slowly, his expression shifting from interest to concern to something like fear as he progressed through David's description. He's trapped, Turner said when he finished reading. Yes. But where? How can he be close enough to see the farm but not reach it? I don't know. They sat together in silence, 2 men trying to make sense of a situation that made no sense, trying to find logic in circumstances that seemed to violate basic principles of space and distance and the relationship between seeing and reaching. You going back to the clearing? Turner asked. Yes. Want company? Henry appreciated the offer, but shook his head. This felt like something he needed to do alone, needed to experience without the complications that other people's presence would create. He needed to go to the clearing, needed to stand where David had stood, needed to see if there was any way to reach his brother across whatever barrier separated them. I'll be careful, Henry said. Turner nodded, clearly wanting to say more, but understanding that nothing he might say would change what Henry needed to do. Henry rode to David's farm immediately, not stopping at his own place, not waiting for better preparation or more supplies. He arrived by mid-afternoon and went directly to the barn to saddle David's horse. His own horse was tired from the ride to Hartville and back, needed rest before being used for further travel. He rode north from the farm into the forest, following the route he remembered from the search party's exploration. heading toward the clearing where Price had found the carved oak. The forest was quiet in the way that April forests were quiet. Birds calling occasionally, wind moving through new leaves that were just beginning to appear. The sounds of spring establishing itself after winter's end. He found the clearing without difficulty. The oak stood at its center exactly as he remembered it, the carved message, visible on its trunk even from a distance. Henry dismounted and approached the tree slowly, reading the carved words again, even though he had memorized them during the original discovery. The storm took me. Tell Henry I tried to. He stood in front of the carved message, put his hand flat against the bark, felt the grooves where David's knife had removed wood to form letters. "David," he called out, "if you can hear me, I'm here. I got your letters. I'm trying to understand." No answer came. Just the forest sounds, just the wind, just the emptiness of a clearing that held no visible presence beyond the tree and the carved message and Henry himself. He walked the clearing's perimeter, examining it carefully, looking for any sign that David was present but hidden, any indication that the space contained more than it appeared to contain. He found nothing except the normal features of a forest clearing: trees, undergrowth, fallen leaves, the patterns that nature created without human intervention. He returned to the oak tree and examined the ground around it carefully. David had mentioned standing here, mentioned carving the message, mentioned being unable to leave the clearing despite walking in multiple directions. But the ground showed only the same disturbed leaves that had been visible during the original search, showed no new evidence, no tracks that were fresh enough to suggest recent presence. Henry sat down with his back against the oak, facing outward toward the clearing's edge, and waited. He had no clear plan, no specific expectation of what waiting might accomplish, but the letter had said David could sometimes see Henry, could observe him even if Henry could not observe David. So Henry sat where he could be seen if David was present in some way that normal vision could not detect. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky, tracking its normal path from east to west, creating shadows that lengthened as afternoon progressed toward evening. Henry sat without moving, watching the clearing, listening for any sound that might indicate presence, waiting for any sign that David was near. None came. As dusk began to fall, Henry accepted that sitting and waiting would not be sufficient, that whatever separated him from David was not something that patience alone could overcome. He stood, brushed leaves from his clothes, took one last look around the clearing, and saw something. Not David, not a person, but a change in the light at the clearing's edge, a darkness that was not quite shadow, not quite cloud, not quite fog, not quite anything he had seen before, but that was definitely present and definitely wrong in ways that made his chest tighten and his breathing become difficult. The darkness moved, not quickly, not with obvious intention or direction, but moved in the way that weather moved, drifting across the clearing's edge, like something being carried by wind that Henry could not feel and that did not affect the trees or grass or anything else visible. He stood very still, watching the darkness, trying to understand what he was seeing. It was not solid. He could see trees through it, could see the forest beyond it, could see individual leaves and branches through what should have been obscuring. But it was present, was visible as a kind of dimming or filtering or alteration of the light that passed through the space it occupied. The darkness continued its slow progression across the clearing's perimeter, moving from east to west in a path that suggested deliberate travel, even though nothing about it indicated consciousness or control. As it moved, Henry noticed that the trees it passed seemed to fade slightly, seemed to become less distinct, as if the darkness was creating distance or removing clarity or imposing some kind of separation between what he was seeing and what existed. And then, through the darkness, he saw a figure, a person, standing at the clearing's far edge, positioned in a way that suggested observation, that suggested the figure was looking toward Henry, even though facial features were not visible through the obscuring darkness. The figure was the right height to be David. The posture was familiar, weight slightly on one leg, shoulders set in the way David stood when thinking or watching something that required attention. The clothing looked like what David wore, though details were impossible to confirm through the darkness. "David," Henry called out, his voice loud in the quiet clearing. The figure did not move, did not respond with gesture or sound, just stood at the clearing's edge, visible but static, present but unreachable in ways that made Henry's understanding of distance and proximity feel unreliable. Henry started forward, walking quickly toward the place where the figure stood. But as he moved, the darkness moved as well, shifted its position in ways that maintained the separation between Henry and whatever lay beyond it. He walked faster, trying to close the gap, trying to reach the figure before the darkness could relocate it further away. But the distance would not close. No matter how fast Henry moved, the darkness shifted at the same pace, always keeping the figure at what appeared to be 20 or 30 yards distant, always maintaining separation that movement could not overcome. Henry stopped, frustrated by the impossibility of what he was experiencing. He was walking toward something he could see clearly. Walking should close distance. Each step should bring him closer to what he was approaching. But the normal relationship between motion and proximity was not applying here, was being violated or suspended or rendered meaningless by whatever the darkness was creating. He tried running, tried moving at a speed that should overcome whatever mechanism was maintaining distance. But running produced the same result as walking. The darkness shifted. The figure remained at the same unreachable distance, and Henry found himself back at the oak tree in the clearing's center after running in what should have been a straight line toward the clearing's edge. He tried different directions, approached from the north, from the south, from angles that should bypass whatever the darkness was doing. But each attempt ended the same way. Movement that should close distance instead maintained it, and Henry found himself returning to the oak tree, as if all paths through the clearing led back to its center regardless of the direction chosen. After perhaps an hour of attempting different approaches, different speeds, different strategies for reaching the figure, Henry had to accept that he could not close the distance through physical movement alone. Whatever separated him from the figure, from David, he was increasingly certain it was David, was not mere space that walking or running could traverse. He stopped at the oak tree, breathing hard from exertion, and called out again. "David, if that's you, if you can hear me, I'm here. I got your letters. I'm trying to reach you." The figure remained motionless, did not respond to voice or gesture, just stood at the clearing's edge as the darkness continued its slow movement around the perimeter, carrying the figure with it or maintaining its position within the obscuring space. Henry watched as the darkness and the figure made a slow circuit of the clearing. The movement was steady, unhurried, creating the impression of something mechanical or predetermined rather than something responsive to circumstance or influence. The figure remained visible throughout the circuit, always at the same distance, always positioned in ways that suggested awareness of Henry's presence, but that showed no acknowledgement or response. As full darkness began to fall with the approach of night, the strange darkness began to fade. becoming less distinct from the natural darkness that evening created. The figure faded as well, becoming less visible, eventually disappearing completely as the last light left the sky and the clearing became invisible in the night that held no moon. Henry stood alone in the dark clearing, listening to the night sounds of the forest around him, trying to process what he had witnessed. He had seen David, or had seen something that looked exactly like David, trapped within or beyond the strange darkness that moved without wind and maintained distance without physical barrier. The letters had been accurate. David could see the farm, could see Henry, but could not reach either one despite proximity that sight suggested. Henry made his way back to David's farm, carefully through the dark forest, following paths he knew well enough to navigate without light, his mind occupied with what he had witnessed and what it might mean. He spent another restless night in the cabin, lying awake thinking about the figure in the darkness, about the way distance had refused to close, despite movement intended to close it, about the implications of his brother being visible but unreachable. Over the following days and weeks, Henry returned to the clearing repeatedly. Sometimes the darkness was present, sometimes it was not. When it was present, he could sometimes see the figure standing within it, could sometimes observe David trapped in whatever space the darkness created or represented. When the darkness was absent, the clearing appeared normal, just forest and the oak tree and the carved messages that remained as the only physical evidence of David's presence. Henry tried various approaches to breaking through whatever barrier the darkness created. He tried throwing objects toward the figure, thinking physical items might traverse distance that he could not. The objects, stones, sticks, pieces of food, would sail through the air for a short distance and then fall to the ground as if hitting an invisible wall, landing perhaps 10 yards from where Henry stood, despite being thrown with force that should carry them much further. He tried calling specific messages, thinking that if David could see him, David might be able to hear him even if responding was impossible. He called information about the farm, about their mother, about ordinary things that might provide comfort or connection. He received no response that he could detect, no indication that his voice was reaching through the darkness to where David stood. He tried waiting for long periods, sitting at the oak tree for entire days, watching the darkness when it appeared, looking for any change in its behavior, any variation in how it moved or how the figure within it responded. The darkness remained constant in its slow circuit of the clearing. The figure remained motionless, except for the movement that the darkness's circuit created. As spring progressed into summer, Henry noticed that the carved messages continued appearing, even though he had not witnessed David carving them. He would visit the clearing and find fresh carvings on trees that had been unmarked during his previous visit. The messages were always brief, always incomplete, always suggesting that David was aware of Henry's presence and attempts to reach him, but was unable to respond except through carving words into wood during times when Henry was not present. "I see you trying. I want you to know I see you. Time is wrong here. Days don't pass the way they should. The darkness is always between us now. I don't think it will lift." By midsummer, Henry had established a routine. He would visit the clearing 3 or 4 times each week, would spend several hours there each visit, would watch for the darkness and call out to David even though response never came in any form he could detect. He would search for new carvings, would read them, would try to understand what David was experiencing based on the fragmentary messages left behind. His own life was beginning to suffer from the time and attention he devoted to the vigil. His farm required work that he was neglecting. His wife Margaret was worried about his focus on searching for a brother who seemed increasingly unreachable. But Henry could not abandon the effort, could not accept that David was so close, yet permanently separated, could not stop trying to find a way to bridge the distance that sight could cross, but movement could not. In late summer, Henry had an experience that changed his understanding of what the darkness was and what it was doing. He was sitting at the oak tree during one of his regular visits. The afternoon hot and still, the forest quiet in the way that summer afternoons created silence through heat. The darkness appeared, as it sometimes did, materializing at the clearing's edge without warning or transition, present suddenly where it had been absent moments before. And within the darkness, the figure appeared as well. David, standing in his familiar posture, visible through the obscuring space, present but unreachable as always. But this time, Henry noticed something different about the darkness. It was not uniform in its obscurity. There were variations in its density, places where it was thicker and places where it was thinner, creating gradations that suggested structure or organization or pattern that Henry had not noticed during previous observations. And where the darkness was thinnest, Henry could see more clearly, could see David's face, could see his expression, could see details that had been obscured during previous sightings. David looked tired, but not injured, focused, but not afraid, present in ways that suggested consciousness and awareness, even if response was impossible. Henry stood and walked slowly toward the place where the darkness was thinnest, moving carefully, watching to see if the darkness would shift to maintain distance as it had during previous attempts. But this time, the darkness remained stable, did not relocate, allowed Henry to approach to within perhaps 10 yards of where David stood. "David," Henry said, speaking clearly, trying to project his voice through the space that separated them. "Can you hear me?" David's expression did not change. His posture did not shift. But Henry thought, was almost certain, that David's eyes moved slightly, that some small acknowledgement occurred even if full response was not possible. Henry continued speaking, describing the farm, the animals, the work that needed to be done, the ordinary details of life that David had left behind. He spoke about their mother, about Margaret, about the community's concern and the search that had been conducted and the messages that had been found carved in the clearing. As he spoke, he watched David's face for any reaction, any sign that the words were reaching through the darkness that separated them. He saw nothing definitive, nothing that confirmed his voice was being heard, but the sense that some connection existed, that some communication was occurring, even if one-directional, felt stronger than it had during previous attempts. The thin place in the darkness did not last long. After perhaps 10 minutes, the darkness became uniform again, became equally obscure throughout its extent, and the details of David's face were no longer visible. But Henry had seen enough to confirm that his brother was conscious, was aware, was existing in some state that was neither fully present nor fully absent. He returned to that clearing day after day through the rest of summer and into fall, watching for the darkness to thin again, hoping for another opportunity to see David clearly and possibly to establish some form of communication through the barrier that kept them separated. The thin places appeared occasionally, but unpredictably, sometimes lasting only moments, sometimes persisting for longer periods that allowed sustained observation. During these thin places, Henry learned things about David's condition that the letters and carvings had not fully conveyed. David did not appear to be aging in normal ways. He looked exactly as he had looked on March 11th, when the storm had come, showed no evidence of time's passage, despite months having elapsed in the world Henry occupied. David did not appear to need food or water or rest. existed in a state that had no obvious physical requirements, and David appeared to be aware of everything happening around him. When Henry spoke, David's eyes would sometimes track the sound even if direct response was impossible. When Henry moved through the clearing, David's posture would sometimes shift as if following the movement. The separation was not complete. Information could pass through the darkness even if physical presence could not. By October, Henry had accumulated enough observations to understand that David was trapped in some kind of suspended state, existing in a space that overlapped with the normal world, but that operated according to different rules. Time did not pass for David the way it passed in the world outside the darkness. Physical needs did not apply to David the way they applied to normal existence. Communication could occur in limited ways. David could see and possibly hear what happened beyond the darkness, could carve messages during periods when the darkness allowed physical interaction with the world, could write letters that somehow reached the mail system, despite being written from within a space that should be isolated from normal channels of communication. But crossing the barrier remained impossible. Henry could not enter the darkness to reach David. David could not exit the darkness to return to normal existence. The separation was absolute, even if visibility and limited communication were possible. The last carved message Henry found appeared on a tree at the edge of the clearing in late autumn, just before the first frost of the season. It was longer than most of the previous messages, carved carefully into smooth bark that had been stripped to create a clean surface for the words. "Henry, I can see you coming here regularly. I can see you trying to reach me. I want you to know that I appreciate your efforts, even though I can't respond in ways you can hear or see. I'm going to stop leaving carvings after this one. The darkness doesn't let me out as often as it used to, and when it does let me interact with the wood, I'm not sure how much time I have before it pulls me back. I need to save what strength I have for existing, rather than communicating. Tell Mother I love her. Tell Margaret I'm sorry for the worry this has caused. Tell anyone who asks that the storm was real, that it took me somewhere I can't return from, that I'm not suffering even though I'm not where I should be. Don't keep coming here. Don't waste your life watching for someone you can't reach. Live your life. Remember me as I was before the storm, not as whatever I am now. I'm sorry I can't explain this better. I'm sorry the storm chose me. I'm sorry you have to see me like this. Present but not present. Alive but not living in any way that makes sense. Your brother, David." After reading that message, Henry stood in the clearing for a long time, watching the place where the darkness sometimes appeared, hoping to see David one more time before accepting that the vigil needed to end. The darkness did not appear that day. Henry waited until full dark, then made his way back to the farm and began the difficult process of accepting that his brother's advice was correct, that continuing to visit the clearing served no purpose except to prolong pain that would not end while the separation remained absolute. But ending the vigil did not mean accepting David's absence entirely. Henry continued to care for David's farm through that winter, continued to maintain the property in case some change occurred that would allow David's return. He visited the clearing occasionally, less frequently than before, but regularly enough to ensure that any new messages would be found, that any changes in the situation would not go unnoticed. No new messages appeared. The darkness continued to manifest occasionally when Henry visited, continued to show the figure standing within it, but the distance remained uncrossable, and the communication remained impossible, except through sight alone. By the second spring after David's disappearance, Henry made the decision to sell the farm. Maintaining two properties was unsustainable, and the hope that David would somehow return had faded to the point where keeping the farm indefinitely no longer seemed reasonable. The property was sold to a family from the East who knew nothing of its history, who accepted the existing structures and cleared land without asking questions about why it was being sold or what had happened to its previous owner. Henry moved away from the area that summer, unable to remain close to the clearing while being unable to reach the brother who existed within or beyond it. He took with him the letters David had written, the memories of seeing David through the darkness, the knowledge that some separations were absolute even when the separated parties could see each other clearly. He told the story occasionally over the years that followed, told it carefully to people who seemed capable of understanding that truth was sometimes stranger than fiction could afford to be. Most listeners assumed he was describing metaphor or delusion or grief that had created false perceptions. A few understood that he was describing actual events that violated normal understanding of space and presence and the relationship between seeing and reaching. David's story became folklore in the region around Hartville, told with the uncertainty and embellishment that folklore accumulated over time. Some versions emphasized the mysterious storm. Some emphasized the delayed letters. Some emphasized the carved messages that appeared on trees where no one had been seen carving. All versions maintained the core fact that David Marshall had disappeared in March of 1871 and had never been found despite evidence that he remained present in some form that observation could detect, but that rescue could not achieve. The clearing remained, though its significance faded as those who had known David died or moved away. The new owners of the farm avoided it, without knowing precisely why. Avoidance felt necessary, marked it on their property maps as unsuitable for cultivation or development. The oak trees grew old and eventually fell, but new trees grew to replace them, and the clearing persisted as a space that felt wrong in ways that could not be easily articulated. And occasionally, as decades passed into a century and that century approached its end, travelers through the area reported finding fresh carvings on trees in a clearing that should hold only old forest. The carvings were brief, were incomplete, were carved in letters that suggested care and deliberation despite being cut into bark with tools that left rough edges. Messages that said, "Still here, still watching, still close enough to see." Most dismissed these reports as hoaxes or imagination, or the way that old stories created expectation that perception fulfilled. Trees could be carved at any time by anyone, with a knife and an inclination toward perpetuating folklore. But a few understood that the carvings might be genuine, that David Marshall might still exist in whatever space the storm had created on March 11th, 1871. Still separated by darkness that would not disperse, still present but unreachable, still close enough to observe the world he could no longer participate in. The clearing is still there. The trees that now grow there have no memory of the messages carved on their predecessors. The land has changed ownership many times, has been used for various purposes, has been altered by the passage of time and seasons and human activity. But the clearing itself persists, and sometimes in weather that brings darkness, that moves strangely, in storms that create winds without direction and clouds without obvious formation, people passing through report seeing a figure standing at the clearing's edge. Standing motionless, visible but distant, present but separated by space that sight can cross but movement cannot close. Still watching, still waiting, still close, enough to see but too far to reach. Still existing in March 1871, while the world around the clearing moves forward through time, that David Marshall stopped experiencing when the storm came and took him somewhere that letters could be sent from, but that people could not return from.